at some prac SAC style questions or just SAC style questions in general, look at the mark allocations for them, and basically how you go about planning out and writing a full mark answer for them. For the purpose of it just being to try and make your life a little bit easier and less stressful, because a lot of people are losing marks for the technical things and not just their overall knowledge in general. So we're going to look at 4 of them here, just go through them, talk about the mark allocation first, talk about how I'd plan them out, and then write up a sample answer for them that should hopefully get the full marks. So the first one we're going to look at here is to find the government's goal of low inflation. And just one little hint for any SACs or future exams, whenever the words government's goal comes up when you're looking at it, in any question where it says the government's goal, you've got to define the whole goal. If the question just says low inflation, or if it just says employment, you don't have to define the goal. You can just talk about inflation or employment as it is. But whenever it says define, or whenever it says the government's goal, you have to define the whole goal. With this one being a 2-mark definition, the 2 marks come from, firstly, the worded definition of the goal, and then the second part is the percentage measurement. So with inflation, it's not too bad because that's kind of built into the definition that we use. But with some of the other ones, like I noticed on some of the practice things, it's just including that 4.5 to 5% for full employment, those kind of things. So to do it for low inflation, the government's goal of low inflation is for the general level of prices to be increasing at a rate of 2 to 3% on average over time. That last little bit, that on average over time, is ridiculously important. There are other ways that you can write that. You can say on average over the business cycle, but you need something on the end there. It's not just a rate of 2 to 3%. It's on average over time, because it's really important. Like, and this comes up when you look at questions about whether they've achieved the goal of low inflation. It's about in general being in that average area, not just in 1 year. It's over time that they're hitting that 2 to 3%. So that's the 2-mark definition of low inflation. The first mark kind of comes from the general level of prices to be increasing, and the second mark comes from that 2 to 3% on average over time. If you get both those things, you get both marks for it. If not, you lose 1 mark. Then next up, you can basically guarantee you're going to get a question asking you to give a limitation of full employment or inflation. One little hint and one upside for you guys is that I will only ever ask you for one, and for both of them, there are quite a few. So if there is one that you're pretty confident in, definitely use that. The other upside is that you have your open book. So for the time being now, you can just go choose one and describe it. One of the most important things for the 2 marks here is that 1 mark is going to come from just saying what the limitation is. So what the limitation is. And then the other mark is going to come from describing why that's a limitation. And that's where people, even when it's open book, might make a mistake. So how this ends up working, the one that I use every single time for full employment is that to be considered employed, you only have to be working 1 hour per week. And that's a limitation. So like that's what the limitation is. So that's the first mark. So one limitation of full employment is that to be considered employed, you might only be working 1 hour per week. That's the first mark. The second mark comes from describing why that's a limitation. So why that's a limitation is because many of those people working 1 hour per week would be considered to be underemployed because they would actually be wishing to work many more hours. They might want to work full time. And that's where it gets you that second mark. So if we were to write that up, one limitation of how full employment is measured is that to be considered employed, someone only needs to be working 1 hour per week in the survey week. This is a limitation because many of these people would be considered underemployed as they would wish to work more hours to improve their living standards. So main reason there, like just that second little point, kind of just highlights why that's a limitation. So for many of these people, working more would be better for them, but because they're considered employed, in that measurement of full employment, it actually makes it look like the government is achieving their goal pretty well. Then after that, where it gets a little bit more complicated, and this one would be a tricky question that I feel like a lot of people would lose a mark on. So this next one, discuss how a decrease in the exchange rate would impact the goal of full employment. So with that already, because we've got this here, the goal of full employment, we are going to need to define the goal of full employment. With discuss here, that means that we're going to have to talk about two potential effects. Whenever you get a discuss question, like it's usually positives and negatives, but sometimes in economics that can actually be multiple effects that are occurring. And then when you are talking about those effects, you'll kind of describe what the exchange rate is. So if we were to break that down into the marks, it's going to be 1 mark for defining the goal. One mark for a positive impact, 1 mark. Oh, it's kind of like 1.5 marks for a positive impact and 1.5 marks for the negative impact. So why this is important is a lot of people would treat this like an explain question. Most people would go straight to the fact that a decrease in the exchange rate would mean that we're importing less and exporting more, which is favorable. That's more injections into aggregate demand, which means that businesses will employ more labor, and that will help decrease the rate of unemployment and helps us achieve the goal of full employment. So that's the positive impact. What people would miss is the negative impact, is where we look at it from the aggregate supply side. So I'm going to put that in here too. So the positive impact is AD side, and the negative impact is AS side. So on the aggregate supply side, for the negative impact, when the exchange rate decreases, our businesses use a whole lot of imports as factors of production. So when the exchange rate decreases, this actually makes the imports that they use in production more expensive, and actually leads to high production costs for businesses, where then they may want to lay off workers to maintain their profitability, and that can lead to less employment overall and make it harder to achieve the goal of full employment. So if we were to write this, first up, the government's employment is to have the lowest rate of unemployment possible without running into unnecessary external or inflationary pressures. This is regarded as around 4.5 to 5% natural unemployment existing in the economy. So that's the first mark, saying what the goal is. And then we get into the positive and negative. So we'll start off with talking about what a decrease in the exchange rate is. So a decrease in the exchange rate would mean that the Australian dollar has fallen in value. One positive of this is that it makes our exports more attractive to our trading partners, which is an injection to aggregate demand, and lowers our volume of imports, which decreases leakages. This this increase in AD would send a signal to producers to increase their production levels. To do this, they would then need to employ more labor, which decreases the unemployment rate and helps achieve the goal of full employment. So that's the first one. And it seems like a lot for 1.5 marks, and it kind of is. But then we'll get into the negative. So 1 negative of a decrease in the exchange rate on the achievement of full employment is that businesses in Australia use use imports as factors of production. A weaker Australian dollar would mean that the production costs of many businesses would increase. To maintain profitability, businesses may choose to lay off workers, which increases the unemployment rate and makes it harder to achieve the goal of full employment. So it's a fair bit there, but there's a bit to work through in terms of what it is. But with each of them, hopefully you can see that, like with anything aggregate demand sites, like we talked about in the past, where you talk about the initial effect on aggregate demand, so how it affects the components. So we talked about how it affects exports there, and then how it affects aggregate demand and that flow-on effect. Whereas from the supply side, we've talked about the fact of production costs, and then to maintain profitability, they're laying off workers, which increases unemployment. And that would get you the full marks there because you've discussed it, you've talked about both sides. Then this last one, explaining how a decrease in personal income tax rates could impact aggregate demand and the inflation rate. This one's a little bit simpler than the one before. So with this one, firstly, you're describing what a decrease in personal income tax would mean. Right, a decrease in personal income. Not too bad. You talk about that would increase people's overall disposable income. Then you talk about, you get 1 mark for how it impacts components of AD and AD overall. So that's when you talk about the fact that that would decrease tax revenue, which is a leakage from aggregate demand, and increase the private consumption spending, which would lead to an overall increase in aggregate demand. And then the last mark would be how it impacts the inflation rate. So if we make this into an answer, so a decrease in personal income tax would mean that consumers are able to keep a larger portion of their salary and therefore have a higher disposable income. This would mean that there are less leakages to aggregate demand as taxation revenue has fallen. This would also mean that private consumption spending would increase, which would increase aggregate demand overall. If aggregate demand is increasing at a rate faster than production can keep up with, this would put upward pressure on prices, leading to higher rates of inflation. And with that last sentence, you've really pointed out how it impacts the rate of inflation. And it's kind of like step by step talked about all the impacts that needs, and that would get the full 3 marks there. What often happens and what's been happening so far is people just miss out little things. Like when you talk about the components of aggregate demand, people have just been saying increasing spending. It's just doing little things like making sure you say private consumption spending or saying tax revenue has fallen. But it's just that step by step, like how it impacts the components and then how it impacts the rate overall. That's essentially it for this little thing. Hopefully it was somewhat useful. I don't know, I just figured that it would be nice to at least talk through how some of these things work. Let me stop sharing that screen now.